Hello, I'm Alex from Mozaic Works Studios, once again in a very interesting conversation. As I started doing for a number of videos, I am discussing now with people who have more experience than my age, which is very, very interesting to me. And one of these people is here today. Michael Hill, but known as GeePaw Hill on the internet. He is, I learned more about GeePaw Hill by following him on Twitter. So basically everything I know is what I've read on Twitter and what I've read on the website. But I'm expecting a very interesting conversation. So that's all I know about you. Perhaps you can say a few words about yourself, how you got into this programming business and kind of what you are doing now, and then we'll go step by step through a few topics.
Sounds great. Hi, Alex. It's really nice to see you. Yeah, so it really is GeePaw. People really do call me GeePaw. Now I'm an old man, right? So obviously I'm a grandfather. But when I first became a grandfather, I was just 31 years old. My wife is a little older than me, and she had kids who were almost, when we got married, they were almost ready to be married and off themselves. And so I got my first grandchild when I was 31, and my friends thought that was hilarious. So they started calling me grandfather, then grandpa, and now GeePaw. And so that is really what people call me. It is GeePaw. I've been a geek for about 40 years. I started in 1980. I did not know that I wanted to be a programmer. I started by selling personal computers. 1980 was the year when the personal computer explosion happened. And I sold computers. I'm a pretty good talker. So I was good at doing the sales, but I would do the sales from like 9 in the morning till noon. And then from noon until 9 at night, I was obsessed with finding out how they worked. And that's what turned me into a programmer. I started an interest group about Forth, the programming language Forth. And I had that interest group for about 6 months, and then one of the guys says, "Hey, do you think you could help us write a Forth?" And I said, sure. and a star was born. I went off and I wrote a Forth in about 6 weeks for a new CPU. In those days, new CPUs came out like every month. Every 2 months, there'd be a whole new computer with a whole new operating system and everything. And so my first job was actually implementing Forth on new machines, pretty much full time. I got it down to a science that basically involved: could you hook up a serial cable? If you could hook up a serial cable, I could get you a Forth running in a couple weeks. So that's how I became a programmer.
Okay, so Forth is an old language, and I'm not sure many people know what it's about. Looking back at Forth, what do you think? Did it influence you in any way, in the way you write programs today, in the way you think about programs?
It absolutely did. I think Forth is a very simple language, and it uses a single stack, and it's an explicit stack. So you push things on. If you see a 3 in the text, it's because the number 3 is getting pushed onto a stack. And then you see a 5, the number 5 is getting pushed on. Then you see a plus, and those two numbers are getting coalesced into an 8 on the stack. So using that single stack in that way gives you an extremely strong sense of having to balance paths. If I have 2 paths, they have to do the same. They have to amount to the same change in the stack, regardless of which path. That gave me a lot of discipline around that. And then opening and closing. The beginning of the function and the end of the function have to be the same. So you become obsessed with beginnings and endings. And both of those very fundamental skills have served me very well, very well. I would, if I was going to start, teaching people who had never programmed before, I might very well consider trying to teach them forth from the very beginning for just 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Learn your way around how this programming language works, because from here I can build up everything else you need to have. So yeah, I'm a huge believer. I would like to, in the event that I ever get up enough money to retire, I would like to spend my retirement returning to Forth and doing a whole bunch more Forth in my life, because I really love the programming language.
And so I'm not very familiar with Forth, but the way you describe it, it sounds like you need to pay a lot of attention to the functions, as you were mentioning, and so on. Could you have long functions in Forth, or by nature you had to make them smaller? Or
you could have long functions, but there were a bunch of sort of mitigating things that made it seem more obvious that you wanted to extract. Mm-hmm. Right? It was more punishing of long functions than a lot of programming languages are. And of course, that decomposition is the heart of programming. So, yeah.
Yes. And I saw that after that you got into extreme programming.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about this? How did you find out first about extreme programming, and why did it seem like something useful for you?
In the early 90s, there was a couple of communities that were out there working towards what became the design patterns movement. And I was not a part of that. But as soon as the design patterns movement sort of exploded on the scene, it took over like all the news groups, right? It's what we were talking about. And the place to go to be a part of the design patterns movement was Ward Cunningham's C2 wiki. Cunningham wrote, the world's first wiki, and that was the world's first wiki. And I went there and hung out, and it was a very egalitarian community. We nobody had any more power than anybody else. We spent all of our time writing long, complicated wiki pages, arguing with each other and adding new ideas and topics. And extreme programming essentially grew up then. And so I was into that movement from a very early time, before it even really had a name or a book associated with it. And the first gathering of extreme programming people was, we called it the XP Immersion, was in 1999. And I attended that, and it was a week-long session, and it was meant to be a class. And about 2 days into the class, I basically teacher. Not because I'm so brilliant and had learned so much in 2 days, but sneaking extreme programming in under the door at all the shops that I was working on for the previous 3-4 years. So by the time I got to this initial class, I was way ahead of folks because I had already been doing it. And so almost as soon as I got into extreme programming officially, I actually became a coach, because that's where I was at, because I had been into it so heavily unofficially. I was a little bit ahead of the pack. So yeah, that would have been the year 2000.
Can you tell me a bit? I'm very curious about the early days of extreme programming and this community around Ward Cunningham's wiki and so on. Did you all kind of work remotely, or you also met and knew each other in person?
Well, so for a long time, the wiki kind of tied us together, although I'm sure that some of the people who were contributing were next door neighbors and knew each other, because a large part of the center of that was in a couple of specific geographical locations. Once we started the first immersion, those were sponsored by Object Mentor, Bob Martin's company, and a bunch of people actually worked for Bob. In fact, I did. Within a year of that first immersion, I was coaching as one of Bob's coaches, and we held so many of those classes that we actually got to hang out with each other a lot. So you'd be, you would basically go home for a month and then go to another class and then go home for a month and go to another class. And in the early days too, we had a very active news groups. We don't even call them that anymore. Now we call them e-lists, but back then they were news groups, and they were very active, very engaged community. And then the gatherings that we would go to were basically geek parties. We would, there was nobody in charge. I mean, we had our leaders, Ward and Ron Jeffries, and of course Kent Beck was the star of the show. Bob was one of the leaders, and there were others. We had our leaders, but we didn't follow orders. we were a rowdy crowd, and if we did not like what we were doing, one of us would say, "I'm not liking this. Let's do something else." And we would change streams right in the middle. We'd just change horses right in the middle of the stream and go in some other direction. It was really just a tremendously cool time. And a lot of people that folks know in the craftsmanship trade, a lot of those people were there. So, Mike Feathers, Bob Martin himself, James Grinning. There were so many of us, and we've all, at this point, we've all known each other for 20 years. It's amazing, and we've all been very active in this movement, sometimes in our different ways. And to me, it's just an incredibly special community. I don't think of myself as agile. I don't use that word very much. I don't care for what that industry has become. But I do very much still think of myself as an extreme programmer, because my roots were in that community, and I love those people. One of the main reasons I go to conferences today is so I can hang out with my old friends who I haven't seen for years at a time.
Yeah, that is really cool, and I've noticed this many times. I witnessed a few meetings of people who are from this community, haven't seen each other for a while, and then they met in Europe at the conference, and I was there, and it seemed something special indeed. So from your point of view, and being so much into this extreme programming movement, what defines extreme programming? What makes it different from what we call agile, or from
So I would say from the outside, just as a strictly descriptive process, the thing that separates it most significantly is extreme programming is deeply committed to finding technical practice. It is not a movement that was primarily focused on how do we organize large companies, or how do we supply burn down charts or monitoring or progress reports. It was about how do we get good. So from the outside, the technical focus is really obvious. From the inside, it's simply the bonding of the community, the fact that we were so open. We would get, oh my gosh, we had the most wonderful fights because somebody would come to us and say, well, that's stupid, I tried this. And then we would yell and scream and shout at how they were breaking all of our understandings. And then sure enough, they were right and we were wrong, and we all just changed our minds and said, okay, now you've got, now you can do it this way, or you can do it that way. They both work. And that only happens because people trust each other enough to wrangle. Right? My wife and I argue And it might scare people who don't know, and I wouldn't argue like that with anybody else, but I argue like that with her because we trust each other. And that was from the inside, that was the cool part of that community.
It was interesting to me. I guess the first person who was deeply into extreme programming that I met was J.B. Rainsberger.
Sure.
And my first impression was, this is a person who kind of looks at code and uses code, I don't know, kind of to model it, to bend it to his will or something like that. And very focused on code and much less focused on other aspects of, let's say, software engineering, like drawing diagrams. Not that we don't do that, but much more focused on code and on the other parts. Is this a correct description, or it's a bit exaggerated?
No, I think it is pretty correct. And I think you actually said it in your very own words there. And I would say the same thing about myself. And of course, Joe and I, again, are old friends who have known each other very closely over the years. You said it, your words, bend the code to his will. That's me too. The thing I keep telling, so many of my muses that you've read on Twitter bring this point out again and again. The code works for me. I don't work for the code. And if I could get one idea into every junior programmer in the world's head, it would be that. Code works for you. So if you and the code are clashing, the code loses every time, because the code works for you. You don't work for the code. And that attitude is deeply embedded in both JB and I. We're absolutely committed to that approach.
Yeah, that was for me like a change in my perspective, because until then, well, in Romania things have been different because we started learning by ourselves. Basically, I went through a university, but teachers in university didn't actually know a lot about code, and not a lot about, let's say, the industrial code development.
Right.
And then when I got into software development, it was basically figuring out how to make things work, because nobody knew. And then after this period, it was very interesting to meet Joe and see his deep dive into, this is the code. You should be able to read it. You should structure it in a way that makes sense, and all this stuff. And that was very interesting. And this also, I understand it's possible also due to the other practices in extreme programming, and it would be useful to discuss them a bit. So things like pair programming, test-driven development, refactoring, which should be core, I think, for programming, but my clients, and I guess your clients as well, often protest to that. It's like, why should we do pairing? Why should we do refactoring? Why should we do... So
you've hit me sort of that's kind of a softball pitch, because this is right up my alley.
Yeah. So how do you get to, for example, pair programming, and why would you want to do that?
So, well, actually, we could take all of those practices and sort of put them together. The fundamental, probably 2 or 3 assumptions in the trade about what programming is are essentially, they're not accurate. So the pair programming usually runs into the assumption that says programming is typing, right? And so if you start with the belief that programming is typing, then obviously having 2 people at one computer is going to be less productive. But you got to break that assumption, because programming isn't typing. Programming is changing abstractions in an abstract hierarchy. And in one word, programming is thinking. So in fact, that opens the whole question. As soon as we toggle off that assumption and say programming is thinking, now ask me why pair programming is useful. It's useful because we are thinking together, and two people can think significantly faster than one person can think. And everybody's experienced this. Every manager on earth has experienced this. Because have you ever solved a problem of any kind when you were in the shower?
Yes.
Right. So the first thing you notice is you don't always think because you're in action. Sometimes you think because you're free to think. Pairing enables that. Have you ever solved a problem as you were trying to explain the problem to your spouse who doesn't care at all about what your problem is? Right? We call it rubber ducking.
Yes.
Right? You take your rubber duck and you explain it to the rubber duck, and then you solve the problem. Again, that's because that's one of the reasons why pairing is so effective. Have you ever pushed yourself too hard in the wrong direction because you thought sure that the wrong direction was right? Well, pairing helps stop that, because your pair, and this is one of those lesser understood values of pairing, but your pair actually helps break focus. Because your pair is going to say, well, why don't you just use an array? And you're like, well, you see, Billy, okay, yeah, let's use an array, right? You see this all the time in pairing. So all we had to do was pull off of that basic fundamental assumption that says programming is typing, and it becomes obvious why pairing is so effective. We can do the same thing with the others, right? With TDD and refactoring. We can do that with of course, with mobbing. We can do it with all sorts of these things if we can just get those underlying commitments that the trade makes to its ideas. If we can just jiggle those a little bit, we can actually demonstrate that extreme programming and its ideas may not be the most perfect ideas ever, but they're not crazy. They're legit. And if you actually give them a try, you might find they're very effective.
Yes, I'm actually a big fan of extreme programming practices. I've been using them for a long time, and my favorite way of organizing, whenever I have the freedom of organizing a team, is by starting with extreme programming and just the minimum stuff around it as much as possible. But it's also quite hard for people who don't know these practices to get into them. It seems to me that when I read, for example, the Agile Manifesto, it seems to me that there's an assumption there that the people who wrote it already knew the technical practices, and they kind of assume that other people would do the same technical practices. And this is something that has been hurting along the way.
I absolutely agree. I have some difficulty with some corners of the craftsmanship movement. We can talk about that in a minute, but the part of that movement that I like the most is the part that is focused on, let's give these junior programmers some damned experiences. Let's let them actually try this out and get it under their fingers, because that is how you get any of these practices working, is by actually trying them in safe environments where a person can really see, is this better or not? And really get a sense. You and I could spend all day today talking about how to ride a bicycle, and it would not help even one 6-year-old ride a bicycle. The only way to learn to ride a bicycle is to ride it. And you and I can stand around and help them and give them advice once they start, but they've got to start. And yeah, that's a big problem. And you're right. The manifesto is written from a very abstract point of view. And although I will say that one of the reasons I don't associate with that word agile very much is precisely because even at that level of abstraction, they instantly break it, right? We value people over processes. And that is why You must have a Scrum meeting. You must have a backlog. You must have a burn down chart. You must have, I'm like, no, that's valuing processes over people. So even that very first thing, it's like instantly, we have failed to communicate successfully what we meant. That's my view.
So going back to these practices, how did you start writing tests, for example, for your code? How did you start doing test-driven development?
Well, so I did what almost all juniors do, right? I did katas. I did little baby toy exercises. And then I said, oh, I totally got this. And then I rushed into real programming projects and I tried to do it. And if you've never done that, I mean, for our audience, if anybody in our audience has never done that, boy, are you in for a shock. Because it's a lot harder in real projects. And the reason it's harder is because those little leaf classes that we use for our katas, they don't have any tricky dependencies. They're at the leaf, they're leaves on the dependency tree. Well, it's easy to do TDD there. The hardest thing for me to learn, and in the beginning, we didn't have people who were particularly teaching us this. We taught ourselves and each other this, but chapter 2 of TDD is a whole lot harder than chapter 1 because in chapter 2, what you have to learn is how to rearrange your code so that it doesn't have those dependencies that are causing you so much pain. And in the early days, we tried a bunch of different techniques. All of them are valid. Some of us broke it into schools of practice. I know some people who use auto mockers all the time. I never use them. I don't approve of them, and I don't use them. But I say that I don't approve of them. I'm not really quite all that judgy. It's more, I don't myself find they make my code better. But yeah, it was hard. It was hard, and I floundered around for a couple of years because I didn't have people like Joe Rainsberger or James Grinning giving me that insight. We were all at the same level at that time, trying to come up with it ourselves. And I think nowadays we do have some advantage because with test-driven development, we actually have a body of practice and a body of techniques that we can reasonably explain. Although I still find when I go out there, a great deal of the pedagogy, a great deal of the teaching of TDD is still basically just teaching chapter 1 and walking away. And that's not good enough. That's one of the big problems in our trade is that, you need more than chapter 1 in order to be a test-driven developer.
Mm-hmm. So I understand from what you are saying that you don't favor mocks that much. If we can go now into a bit more technical things.
Sure.
So you prefer to write the classicist style of tests with value-based and...
Right. I do use value or data-based tests for the most part. I occasionally will hand roll a class that is actually going to test behavior, but only occasionally and only in hand rolling. And here's my rationale. If you take a tool like Mockito, right, which by the way, for a developer in maybe her second or third year of Java programming, you should go and sit with Mockito and read the code because it is magnificent. It is truly an extraordinary. This is how you get inside a programming language, right? So it's a brilliant piece of work. But the problem with it is it'll do anything. And in particular, it will solve problems for you test-wise that actually are deep, deep problems in your design. And if you let it's like you're evading the problem. By using Mockito as a super powerful tool, you are avoiding fixing your design. But actually, fixing your design is more important. So I generally do not recommend teams go mock crazy. I do recommend they get good at hand rolling fakes. But that actually isn't that hard. And in fact, the code you get when you hand roll a fake is usually far easier to grasp when you're reading your test, because there's my fake right there, and it isn't a set of instructions to Makito or to some other app. It's right there. It says return a 4 when you call me. It says notice that you called the play method, so set the play flag to true. Right? It's all of that stuff. It makes it much easier for me to grasp the tests that I write. I do sometimes write code that has a permanent fake of some kind. Right? If you know what I mean. It's like my mock class turns out to be so useful to other tests than the one I'm in that I extract it out and it becomes just part of the test as a known thing. I don't start there. I discover it later. Anyway, yeah, I'm not a big automatic.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. But now I will channel a bit our parts of our audience, which will say, this sounds like a lot of work. Why should I, try to learn unit testing or test-driven development and write those tests? And because it's much more work than, I just sit down and do my task.
Right. And here's why. Because you're wrong. And what I mean, what? I'm wrong? Yeah, the part you're wrong about is to see your day of writing code as a lump of coding. Right? Because your logic here is that I already spend all day long, say you write 100 lines of code today, and it took you all day. You already spent all day long writing 100 lines of code. And now some bozo like me comes along and says, now write 100 lines of test. And you say to yourself, that's a lot more work because now I have to write 200 lines of code. But the thing is, what you're doing all day while you write those 100 lines of code isn't writing code. It is debugging. It is rearranging. It is thinking, and to an incredible extent, it is sitting at the keyboard waiting for your program to run. People really do not appreciate, especially in this world of the web stack, they do not appreciate the staggering amount of time they spend doing things like rebooting the server, refreshing the browser, opening up the tool thing again, searching through the logs for the part of the code that's going wrong. And they don't understand how much time they spend coding that isn't coding. Test-driven development attacks that time so sharply that it can easily leave room for the extra 100 lines of code that you have to write. So you wind up with actual performance. Test-driven development isn't the same speed as testless development. It's faster because typing's not the bottleneck, and because what you do all day testlessly is not coding. It's several different activities. And test-driven development attacks those other activities. You can see, this is something I feel very strongly about.
Yeah, well,
it's not more work, it's actually less work.
I tell the same things to people, and I've noticed myself when I started doing test-driven development. Actually, first, what we did, I worked in a C++ project where we had to write our own unit testing framework and to actually write unit tests for all the code. This was the requirement from our client. And doing that, I noticed that I wasn't doing debugging anymore, which, it's fun for some people, and for me also it was fun to debug sometimes because it's like detective work. It's like a mystery. You find out things, but it's not effective.
Yeah, and of course we all do still pop into the debugger just like we still all add print lines from time to time, right? But I just do a lot less of that. And I do it on a lot more interesting puzzles than the ones I used to do it on.
Yeah.
Right? Puzzles that really call for it instead of always doing that because it's the only way you have to find out what happened.
Now, one interesting thing with test-driven development is it's also a way to structure your code in the end and to obtain a design. Now, the problem with this is how do you get people to understand and to sense which is good design versus poor design, or better design versus worse design? That's a huge problem I've seen. It's very hard to get there.
It is. So it is. If we sat down and wrote down the sort of object-oriented ideas that arose from the late 80s and early 90s and even into the late 90s, like solid conversations about decoupling, all these sorts of ideas. One of the things that is coolest about test-driven development for me is that the insistence, which I have, that it be easy for me to write those tests, that insistence, oddly enough, shapes my designs so that they're actually much more in keeping with those 90s principles, right? It's like, I don't worry a whole lot about solid, but my designs wind up being solid because I'm so obsessed with laziness, because I don't want to write hard tests, right? I don't want to take hard shots. I want to take easy shots. It turns out that what those guys were discovering back then was exactly the thing that makes code easy to test. So if you just say, no, I'm too lazy to do a lot of work to test this, I will rearrange the code so that it's easy to test. If you just say that, you wind up with good designs. Now, I think that, perhaps bottoms out at some point and no longer works. But you have to bear in mind that, as a trade, we are not, in fact, filled with brilliant practitioners with years and years of experience. And so almost any improvement that can affect somebody who's been a developer for less than 2 years will have profound impact on the trade. So I don't know. I don't know if those two different ways of looking will eventually come into conflict or not, but I know that at the level that our general broad population of practicing geeks is, it definitely isn't going to be a problem for a while. So that's my take on that.
Okay, so do you teach developers how to do test-driven development and these practices?
It's so funny. I used to teach a lot, and I wrote Industrial Logic's test-driven development course. I wrote, of those 6 volumes, I wrote maybe, over a third, maybe even as much of half of that material. And I taught that material for several years. And I certainly enjoy teaching. I am not currently out there in the world doing direct teaching as much as I am creating content so that students can learn from me, outside the classroom. That's really my focus nowadays, is trying to make more content. But I'm wobbly. I know this. What I don't want to do, you mentioned when we were talking earlier about being a road warrior, being on the road all the time. I did that for 25 years, and I don't want to go back to doing it. I just can't. I think it would kill me. And so whatever I do in terms of teaching or writing or making videos or whatever it is that I'm going to be doing, I want it to be done mostly from right here on this couch in my house. And so it's unclear to me whether I'll be constructing courses soon or pitching myself as a teacher or trying to teach online continuously, or whether I'll just be continuing to put out content. We'll see how that goes.
But yeah, I'm curious about one thing, which is if you were to teach or to help developers get into test-driven development, let's take this example because it's one of the hardest practices. How would you do it today?
Okay. Part one, of course, you've got to learn the tool a little bit. This is how you write a damn test. This is what a test says. This is how you make your test say what went wrong. This is how you make tests small enough, right? So that's all sort of part one. Part two, you have to address what I call, and what at Industrial Logic they taught, and from my material, awkward collaboration. An awkward collaboration is a collaboration where I want to test some code, but unfortunately, that code does something that uses a collaborator that makes it very hard to test. The classic example of this is just a physical file. People don't think of physical files as being hard to test, but they are. If you write an API in Java that takes an argument of type file, you have committed yourself to testing that thing by using a physical file on a physical drive, and there's no faking it. File is a final concrete class in Java, and there's no getting around it. On the other hand, if you write that code so that it uses a stream object, either an output stream or an input stream, depending upon your problem, then all of that awkwardness goes away. So that concept of awkward versus graceful is the next thing they have to learn. And in particular, they have to learn how to how to move from one to the other, how to recognize what's awkward and transmute it to something that is less awkward. Awkwardness can come from a lot of places. So awkwardness could be very slow runtime. It could be very long setup. It could be having to do some trash, like write all over my disk and then trash, or write all over my database and then untransact it, all of those things. So that would be the next thing. The third thing would be brownfield. I would want, once I've got that second part under my belt, I'm ready to tackle code that wasn't written this way. And this is one of the things that to be honest, test-driven development teachers everywhere just suck at this. But let's be fair, so does classical computer science pedagogy. It's all greenfield, greenfield, greenfield. Well, Alex, I'm not in greenfield after the first hour, right? After 1 hour of writing code, there ain't no greenfield. The page already has something written on it. I'm not writing from scratch anymore after that first hour. So the third part is all of the stuff you have to do in a brownfield environment where you didn't get complete control in the beginning. And because that's the overwhelming majority of the code that we work with every day. And it isn't even just that I didn't TDD it. Somebody else may have TDD'd it, and they may still have not created what we want. So, the brownfield problem isn't just, those bad guys wrote bad code. It's often we didn't write what we want because we didn't know what we wanted when we wrote it. So anyway, those would be, that would be my my approach. And I would not be, the material I wrote for Industrial Logic is multi-vision. It has lots of different angles in it. And I would not be. I would actually be pretty, nope, this is how you do it. There are 5 options, and I'll give you one slide that has the four options I don't like, and then I'll show you in detail the option that I use. Because, I'm not a generalist. I'm a specialist, and I'm opinionated. And I think that one of the problems with our trade is we don't actually have enough experts out there who are really able to give committed advice. We have too many surveys and too many bullet points and not enough digging deep.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned you mentioned earlier the design patterns community. I actually have some connections with them. I was very surprised to see that it is one of the longer lasting communities in software development. It's it's very old. I had actually a conversation with Joe Yoder about this, and Rebecca Worsbrook is yeah. So how was your let's say, what was your connection with the design patterns community?
So, in those days, right, I was very fringe. I was mostly lurking and learning from them, and wasn't being very active in the community, except by way of being the person who asks the stupidest questions, right? Which is an important role in any community. but when the Gang of Four book came out, I was blown away by how much material there was in it and how many ideas. I did what most noobs do when they encounter something like that, which is I became patterns happy. Within 5 years of the publication of that book, that term became widespread. Patterns happy. It's where you use a pattern because it's cool and not because it solves any problem you actually have. And I made plenty of bad software using design patterns, but I think that's a normal thing. When you learn a new thing, you want to do it. You want to do it all the time. But no, my real activity came after that movement was really underway heavily. I noticed that I think it's rude for me to go look at a browser right now, but I noticed the other day there's a PLOP conference this year. I didn't even realize they were still at it. I did not know myself.
Yes.
Yeah,
we are actually discussing to organize a PLOP camp in Romania. So
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yes.
Well, I was like, I think I still have the first 4 volumes of the proceedings from the PLOP conferences, and they're full of great stuff. They really are. There's a lot of great papers in there.
Okay. So you mentioned before software craftsmanship, or today I call it software craft because it's it's a more inclusive term.
Agree.
We've been involved in this. Actually, I've been involved in this quite early because it so happens that Corey Haynes came to Romania very, very early after the movement started, and we got into that. And in my mind, it's a continuation of extreme programming in a way. At least in Europe, what has happened is that a lot of communities were formed that are practicing things. So you can go in a lot of cities in Europe, sit down with developers, write some code, do a kata, do a coding dojo, code retreats, which I really love, which we have organized a long time. What is your opinion of this? Because you also mentioned.
So I have slightly different associations, but I want to be really clear. I'm not hating on that movement at all. I see some of the good parts and some of the bad parts intertwined a lot. Corey is, of course, an angel of goodness and light, right? Corey's one of my favorite people, and he is also a master geek. And so, the code retreats with Corey and Pat Welch were, amazing stuff to hang out with those guys. So I don't see anything bad with anything he's ever said about that movement and with his sponsoring of that movement. I don't know what the situation is like in Europe. In the U.S., there is a lot of there's a lot of signaling around. If you don't do what a craftsman does, you are immoral. And I find that offensive and troubling. Now, again, I know lots of people who are into the craft movement, and I don't find them all saying that at all. no way, right? In fact, I find them actually being very welcoming, not stern or forbidding. But I do not believe that a person who does not do what we wish that everyone wanted to do, I do not believe that such a person is inherently immoral or inherently irresponsible. Every grown-up in the world has 10 million responsibilities. And it's true that being good at one's job is a potential important responsibility. It's also true that taking care of your mom or your kids is an important one. It's also true that the world is not full of people who are getting to do the thing they want in the world. And so any implications for me that it is irresponsible for a computer programmer to say not TDD. If I don't TDD, I'm irresponsible. Any sense of that I get at all raises my hackles, and I get pretty tense about it. So that's my only critique. The actual underlying love of the trade, oh, that's awesome. Because I have that love already. So that part I totally get. I just don't want to be punishing people.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with this. And whenever I talk about these ideas, I talk about them like, this is something that has inspired me, that has helped me a lot. But it's up to you, it's your choice. Whatever you want to do, nobody can force you. And that's, but there's one chapter here that's very interesting to me, and that's code retreats. Because I'm not sure but Corey actually, so he did the first few code retreats in US, and then we organized in Romania the first code retreat outside US.
Oh, nice.
And it's been very close to the initial code retreat. And then we actually 1 year later, he came back to Romania and we exchanged ways of organizing and structuring, and that's what defined the format. And it was really, really interesting.
Oh, very cool.
It was me and Maria Diacono, who is also our CEO, who facilitated this. And so I'm very curious always to hear about people, what is their experience with code retreats? If you mentioned you've been to a few, what was your experience?
Oh, they're a blast. It's in many respects, they remind me of the kind of ferment that we had in the original early XP gatherings. Of course, I love the pairing, and I love that we repeat pair on the same problem. I mean, I didn't say it right, but I loved that format where I pair with a different person and I'd go back and solve the same problem I solved before. I love that way of learning because it frees us up to, the first time you solve the problem, of course, we mostly don't solve it very well. But the second time we solve the problem, it's we're not actually as worried about the fact that we're not solving it as we are invested in how much fun it is to try a different way to solve it. And I think that is magnificent. That has a magnificent effect. And I've seen many retreats or many sessions where, the fourth time you do it, nobody solves the problem or even tries to. They're just having so much fun.
Yes.
And they'll get they get to the end of their, I don't know how long the segments are, but they get to the end of their hour and they've written one test and they're so excited about it because they use that one test to prove something to themselves that they had never thought of before about how the code could be arranged. And they're not obsessed with the goal of solving life anymore or anything like that. I love that aspect of it. I am a huge talker, as you can tell. And I also like the evenings usually of a code retreat, where those of us who are still left standing go somewhere and just sit around and talk. I really like that part of the process too. I
Yeah.
think we have a lot of people out there who would be a lot more excited about their job and about their work if they could spend time in code retreats with other people who were already excited.
Yeah, one thing I keep telling people in the introduction is, I promise you, you'll leave tired and happy.
Yeah.
That's kind of what happens. Yeah, it's a really cool event, and
I think it's a great
I
one.
wish more people would do it. Actually, it's really nice. So let's get back to something else that you are doing. That's interesting. It's something that you call change harvesting.
Yeah.
I actually didn't look into much detail about this, so I would appreciate a quick introduction into what you mean by this.
So remember when we talked a little bit ago about that assumption that programming is typing, right? And how that assumption is wrong. Another major assumption that is built into the trait is that change is going to end. In other words, the idea that there's a city on the hill, that's the expression I use, and that when we get to the city on the hill in our software product, that we're no longer going to be changing it. That assumption justifies a great deal of bad behavior. The change harvesting viewpoint says, actually, there is no city on the hill. And as soon as you say that, as soon as you accept the idea that the change is continuous, you ask yourself, well, what is that change doing? And the answer is that change is part of a series where we essentially make a change, harvest some value from that change, take that value and use it to make another change and harvest some value from that. And it's this endless sequence of change, harvest, change, harvest, change, harvest. And it is truly endless. Excuse me. And once you get to that point of seeing that it is change, harvest, you can begin to get rid of a whole lot of preconceptions about what is the best way to change our software. And in this sense, I don't necessarily mean just at the code level. I also mean at the organizational level, right? Code, individual, team, organization. It's true of all of us that we are all at all of those levels. I call those dynamic unities. In a dynamic unity, the one thing that stays the same is change, harvest, change, harvest, change, harvest. Anything else can change, but the changing itself doesn't change. So that's the sort of core. And then given that abstract core, how does that relate to the sorts of things that we've learned how to do well in our movement that the rest of the trade hasn't really learned? Well, the contention I have is that they haven't really learned that because their underlying vision says the important thing to do is to rush to point Z out on the horizon, and that we only get value if we get all the way out there, and that there are no intermediate steps. And even if we do break it into steps, those steps will form a perfect straight line, and that the most efficient way for us to work is to only make a change in one part at one time and never change that part again. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what test-driven development says down in the code, and what developing by stories says up in the organization. That's exactly the opposite of what we've been teaching and learning and doing successfully. Change harvesting is an attempt to underpin many of the practices you and I already accept and believe in with a theory that we can use to explain it to people who don't accept it yet. And hopefully even to develop new practices based around those ideas. So if I had to draw it in a picture, it would be the old way is A, and then a long, long arrow, and then Z. And the new way is a whole bunch of short arrows, A, B, C, D, E, F, and notice that they don't go in a straight line. And then eventually approaching Z, right? That's that new way. And that's how test-driven development actually works for the most part, and the refactoring and the working by stories and all that. There's no invention there. I didn't invent any of this technique. I'm just trying to formulate ways to think about the technique that essentially address the reason why the trade so commonly thinks it can do the one straight line thing. And to understand what is the theory underneath all of this. How come? I mean, look, it does seem like that straight line would be more efficient. So then why isn't it? It's not more efficient. We know it's not more efficient. We need to understand why. So that's the change harvesting thing. I'm trying to take a lot of the things that we've learned in the last 20 years about programming and re-express them, not invent new ones, but just re-express them in a way that fits with a hierarchy, that a conceptual arrangement that actually makes it fit. Boy, that was a lot. I went on for a minute there.
Yeah, but it's fine because I recognize many of these things. I notice a lot of people whenever I do coaching who are kind of stuck in this idea that we should do something that's perfect and get it done, and then it doesn't change anymore, when in reality usually something else happens and you need to go back and adjust and so on. And if you think about a lot of engineering in general and a lot of design also, if you look at design disciplines in other domains, it's always a feedback loop. There's always short iterations of feedback loop, exploring different paths, figuring out which one is better. Yeah.
So my idea is basically, can I find a way to jar, shake up these ideas in such a fashion that what comes out is more effective at not just at doing the work, but at giving us a path to the changes that would need to happen to work that way. So we asked the question, how would you teach TDD? Well, the answer to that question is different if you think we're going to get to a finish point than it is if you think that we're going to do the jiggly arrow on our way to TDD. It's a very different answer. And that's the kind of stuff that I want to do. So in change harvesting, we would say that we want all of our changes to be human, local, oriented, taken, and iterative. That's the that's the sort of GeePaw official wording at this point. And when I look at TDD, I see that it does all those 5 things. I mean, that the changes we do in TDD are all of those. When I look at working by stories, I see that it does all those. When I think about my life as a coach, and like most coaches, I started out, like most coaches, I started out as a, certainly a true believer, but also an order giver. You will do this. You are wrong. Da 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 da. And that went just almost exactly as well as you might expect, which was horribly. And over the years, I realized that my approach to coaching had also become this human, local, oriented, taken, and iterative. And I started to think, wow, maybe what I'm talking about is not changing code, not changing individuals, not changing teams. Maybe what I'm talking about is changing. That I've actually, walked into an area that is generally applicable to the concept of how do we effectively change things. And so that's the path that I'm on with the change harvesting.
So
go ahead.
Besides, you mentioned a few practices, TDD, stories, and your coaching where you apply these ideas. Can you give another example where somebody might apply these ideas?
Well, sure. I mean, you mean like an example in the business or just an example out in the world?
We can also do in the world, but in the business is probably more interesting for
Sure. So what I do in the business, I spend a lot of time working with organizations who are, we call them VBCAs, very big corporations of America. That's actually a Monty Python joke, but I work with it. It is right. It's from the short that they show at the beginning of Life of Brian. Meaning of Life.
Yeah.
The short show, and it's the very big corporation of America. And I do a lot of work with VBCAs, regardless of what country they're actually in. They're still VBCAs. And one of the first things that you have to get them to do is change their ideas about planning. And of course, they're not planning at the level of stories. They're planning at the level of, what are we going to get done this quarter, and how are we going to fund it, and all that. And helping them see that there is not, helping them see that what they really want is week to week increase the value that they're creating in any conceivable direction that increases that value. That's what they really want. They only think that they want to achieve this faraway goal. What they really want to do is make, not to put it too bluntly, but make more money every day.
Yeah.
Which translates in software terms to make more value every day. And, everything falls out from that realization. And so that's an example of a place where I might use that framework of ideas. And again, like I say, at this point, it's early days. I have not created a book, the definitive guide to change harvesting or anything like that. But using that terminology and explaining those ideas to them helps them understand, I don't really care what we do in 6 months, as long as we're doing better in 6 months. I don't care in what way. I just care that we're getting more value out of it. And what I find in general is that the people at the top have no problem with that idea. The people at the bottom have no problem with that idea. The people in the middle need a lot of extra love to get to holding that idea.
Yeah, that's what we've noticed as well. That's where we get the most resistance, and it's natural in a way, because in the middle you are more used to maintaining a status quo than with kind of continuous change, and that's all the practices there tend to be around this controlling and maintaining
So when I actually go to actually change those organizations, I use the same 5 words to describe both the change that I'm hoping to get them to and how we are going to approach that change. That's the weird thing about this, right? That I can't just drop in a system. One of my biggest problems with the larger Agile movement is this idea that we can drop in methodologies and that will change everything in this dramatic way and that it's all going to work. Yeah, that doesn't work. Well, what works is making change human, local, oriented, taken and iterative. That's what works. And so you have to do that with all the change, including changing how you think about change.
So if people want to learn more about change harvesting, do you write blog posts or do you publish things about this? Or should they ask you?
So how very kind of you to ask, Alex. Why, yes, as a matter of fact, I do.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm GeePaw Hill. It's GeePawhill. That is how you find me on Twitter.
Mhm.
Every 2 or 3 days, I write a long thread, live improvised thread on my Twitter account that is usually connected to these topics we've been talking about already. If you subscribe to my website, which is free and spam free, what happens is those threads get turned into both blogs and podcasts.
Mhm.
And then they come out 2 to 3 weeks after the live improv one. In addition, I have a handful of videos. I will certainly be adding this video to my website so people can get to us having this conversation. And I'm actually trying to really raise the number of videos that I make because I really enjoy making them, and people are telling me they like getting the info through the video. So website is geepawhill.org.
Yeah.
And you can get and see everything there. And on Twitter, I'm easy to find. Now, I give you fair warning. GeePaw Hill on Twitter is not, it's not a marketing channel. It's you're getting me. And that means we talk about a whole lot of things like music and art and politics and, yes, the trade. Lots and lots of talk about the trade. But one of the things that I like to make it as clear as possible in all of my material is that we are all humans. And our humanness involves lots more things than just code or the business or, it involves our families. It involves our beliefs about art and morality. It involves all sorts of things. All of that stuff will be what you see. And also, I'm not usually safe for work when I'm tweeting. So.
Well, to be honest, as I mentioned in the beginning, the way I got to you was by seeing some very interesting Twitter threads. So, so that works. There's one more thing that I know you're doing, something called the Camerata community.
Yes. So the change harvesting group, right? Essentially, what I wanted to do was create a Camerata. The word comes from, originally was used to describe what was called the Florentine Camerata, which was, you can look up Jess Kerr's work. She has some great videos on the origins of opera and software development. And essentially a Camerata is an informal but regular, steady gathering of individuals who essentially are working on the same problem. Now, they might be doing some of that work together. They might be doing some of it apart. But really what they're meant to be is a kind of continuous, ongoing symposium about the problem as it's developed. So an example of a Camerata that many of you will be familiar with, in Göttingen in 1928, many of the people who would go on to become the greatest physicists in the world were all hanging out, arguing about the consequences of quantum physics. Mm-hmm. In fact, about the differences between quantum and relativistic physics. And those guys then went their separate ways and accomplished insane things out in the world, amazing things. Cold Springs Harbor in the 50s was a similar place that was about biology and about genetics. And so Camaratas come and they go. What I wanted to do was create a place for a Camerata. And I did, in fact, and I charge money. And I try to give value for that. For me, value specifically coming from me, because right now I am the one using that money. But the mission is not to fund me. And that's actually coincidental. The mission is to get a bunch of people who are serious enough about this that they want to pay to participate. Not a lot, but some, $500 for a yearly subscription. You get early access to all of my material. You get reserved seats at all of my things that I do out in the world. You get a dedicated Slack that is just for us. If you're one of the first 50 members, you actually get an hour's consultation with me. So that's how we set it up. We don't know that, the purpose of the Camerata is not to be my salary. We're just using that for now. We don't ultimately know where we want to go with that money that we're gathering. And I'll be very excited to see. But the Camerata could be like Ward's Wiki in the late 90s. It could be a place of bustling and happening. And there are a lot of people there who right now whose names you would know. I have not asked permission to use those names, so I'm not going to. But it's a very active community and getting more active all the time. We're still building our census so that we have the sort of necessary buzz that you need in a community like that, but we're getting there. So that's what the Camerata is all about. And you can find out about the Camerata just by going to GeePaw.
It sounds a lot like the early days of XP that you're talking about. The same. Yeah.
That's certainly my mission and my hope.
Okay, so we are close to an end. It was a very, very interesting conversation. I enjoyed it a lot, and I learned interesting things and perspectives from you, especially around extreme programming, and that's particularly valuable and interesting. And to me, it's also interesting because not many people seem to know about extreme programming, at least in Europe. It's quite not so well known. Everybody would know about Scrum, but not many people know about XP, which is...
And that is true. That is true in America too, right? Everybody knows. People think that Agile means Scrum, but in fact, there were 3 movements that founded and that participated in the creation of the Agile Alliance and the Agile Manifesto, right? There was Scrum and XP and Crystal Clear, and all 3 of those movements are still alive, and But yep, Scrum gets all the press. But if you're doing test-driven development, if you're doing test-driven development, if you're working by stories, if you're doing refactoring, all of those things, those things come from extreme programming. They don't come from Scrum. They come from extreme programming. So I would urge our audience to look into it a little more closely.
Yep. Before we close, is there anything else that you'd like to share that we haven't have a chance to discuss? Or?
Yeah, well, it's nothing to do in particular with code, but it is just this. You'll probably be seeing this a week or 2 from when we're actually recording it out there in the world, and this is a crazy time, full of change all the way around. And I would just say my last shot, and I think Alex, you probably agree with me about this, you all take care of yourselves out there, okay? Be careful, be kind, have a good time.
Lots of thanks to GeePaw for joining me. It has been a very interesting conversation. You've heard him. Take care, stay safe. It's very important. Of course, we all agree, and we try to encourage people to stay as safe as possible. This has been a new conversation in our series about various challenges related to software development. I've been Alex from Mozaic Works Studios, and until next time, stay safe and don't forget to think, design, and work smart.